This is the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Welcome back. I'm your host, Jackson Neill, here on Friday, June 21st, 2019, and today I'm going to be talking with Austin Horton of 1280 The Zone out in Salt Lake City about the latest trade sending Mike Conley to the Utah Jazz. But first, I just want to remind everyone that this podcast is available on all of your favorite platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, and SoundCloud. It is also available on JacksonNeillPodcasts.com, the home for all of the podcasts I publish. In case you're unfamiliar with the trade, Mike Conley was just traded to the Utah Jazz this week from the Memphis Grizzlies in exchange for Grayson Allen, Kyle Korver, Jae Crowder, the 23rd pick in last night's NBA draft, and a future first-round pick that has a lot of protections and things like that on it. So, with Austin, I talked with him about Conley, what he can add to the Utah Jazz. Remember, the Jazz finished 5th in the Western Conference with 50 wins this past season. So they're a contending team. The championship window is wide open in the NBA following the injuries that happened to the Warriors. So, I wanted to get Austin's perspective on why did the Jazz make this move? How good could they be? And will they exceed expectations in 2019 and 2020? What was your initial reaction to the trade?
So, actually, I'm going to start with the trade deadline. At the trade deadline, when all the leaking happened that the Jazz were talking Conley, and at the time I think the report was for Rubio, I actually wasn't a huge fan of the idea of Mike Conley at that time. I was pretty much engrossed in the moment in prepping for Jazz games night in and night out and looking at Jazz opponents and forward to the playoffs and what the Jazz might do there. I was so engrossed in all that I hadn't truly examined just what Mike Conley had been doing all season. I had kind of written him off when the Achilles and heel injuries took place, as always on the other side of 30. He's got these lower leg injuries, and I'll just write him off for now. And I kind of put him out of my mind. Then after the trade deadline thing fell apart or didn't happen, however you want to look at it, then I started looking more into the kind of season Mike Conley was having, and more started thinking, man, if the Jazz could match him in the backcourt with Donovan Mitchell, that's exactly the type of help not only Donovan Mitchell needs, but a guy like Joe Ingles and so on and so forth down the list. A guy who can distribute, a guy who can score, a guy who can draw defense and give you a more of a catch-and-shoot opportunity, and not to mention who had a career high in points per game this last season. And the Jazz, that's what they need, right? Everyone knows around the NBA the Jazz are a defensive powerhouse. They, I think, were 4th in points allowed this season, and then down around 20th, 18th, something like that in points scored. So they obviously needed to upgrade the scoring end of things. So fast forward to now, when this trade happened with Mike Conley, or will happen, it's all reported until it actually goes down after, I think it's July 6th or 1st or somewhere around there. When it does go down, the Jazz are going to add in a piece in Mike Conley who immediately vaults them into a different tier offensively. They'll still be really good defensively. We know what Mike Conley does on the defensive end of things. But suddenly they go from, and we'll just use Ricky Rubio as an example, from a guy who shot 36% and 34% on wide-open field goals and threes last season to Mike Conley, who shot 43% from the field on wide opens and 43% on wide-open three-pointers. So I think that if they can't get one of those top free agents, and the history of the Utah Jazz shows they've not been able to do that, then you got to take matters into your own hands and trade into improving your team, and they certainly did that with Mike Conley. I'm excited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on a lot of that. And I mean, I had the same kind of reaction with Mike Conley this year, looking at his stats and, hearing about, opposite side of 30, like you said, off the injuries, is thinking, you got to tailor those expectations a little bit, and yet he blew past all of mine. But one thing you mentioned there was Donovan Mitchell and Conley in the backcourt. Can you just go a little bit more in depth? Like, what do you think it's going to look like with those two players and how they complement each other on the floor?
Sure. So we saw a handful of games, I want to say 7 or so this season, when Ricky Rubio and backup point guard Howell Neto were both injured, where Donovan Mitchell had to take the reins as more or less the point guard and have the ball in his hands even more than he usually does and create while distributing. And the Jazz record during those games was undefeated. They were undefeated. But when you dive into the stats and the analytics, they were scoring less points and giving up more points than they were at other times of the season. And so I thought there's a lot of people that think Donovan Mitchell's future in the game will be a ball-dominant point guard, I guess. I know we're in, like, positionless basketball era now, but a ball-dominant guard. And that may be, but the Jazz, as of right now, see that as a problem because of his tendency to turn the ball over and rush some decisions. And so when they add a guy like Mike Conley, who can be the dominant ball handler and then set up a Donovan Mitchell or score it himself or set up a Derek Favors if he remains on the team. Or I think Zach Lowe of ESPN pointed out beautifully the numbers of Joe Ingles on catch-and-shoot threes were over 40% the previous 2 seasons until this last year. When he's had to create more, his shooting percentages have plummeted. So a guy like Mike Conley comes in, and specifically for Donovan Mitchell, brings defenses at least another guard they have to respect enough to guard. They can't leave Mike Conley wide open. That will allow, in theory, Donovan Mitchell more open catch-and-shoot opportunities.
Yeah, certainly, and I think, and obviously a player like Conley, like you just mentioned right there, just makes everyone on the floor better and just really opens up the space. I found that interesting that you mentioned how people think Mitchell may develop into this kind of ball-dominant player. Do you think maybe the addition of Conley was also viewed by some as, hey, maybe if we bring in a more veteran point guard who doesn't turn the ball over as much, that could eventually help Mitchell develop into a ball-dominant guard?
You know, it's an interesting thought. I'm obviously not speaking for the Jazz or anyone. Of my own opinion, yes. I think that Donovan Mitchell has done nothing since day one but display an ability to take coaching and criticism from everyone, from the top of the station within the NBA to the lower, to a guy that's on the back of the bench or a guy that's next to him in the starting lineup or an assistant coach or a video guy. Or even if a ball boy were to say, hey, I noticed this, Donovan Mitchell is receptive to improving no matter what it takes. He's a film junkie, and he will take every opportunity to learn and grow and improve his game. And by bringing Mike Conley in, the natural thought leading into that is, well, here's a veteran of 10-plus seasons in the NBA who doesn't turn the ball over, who has high assists, who is able to shoot the ball from anywhere on the floor. He can drive, he can spread it out and shoot it long if he needs, and he plays good defense. Even if he has 2 years left on his deal, with the second being a player option, even if it ends up being just a season, which none of us think he won't opt into $34.5 million at going on 34 years of age. But even if it's just a season or two that Mike Conley is in town with Donovan Mitchell, I think the thought process could naturally be shown that Donovan will glean and absorb some teaching and coaching from Mike Conley and then grow into that ball-dominant guard himself.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, I definitely see how that's possible. And Conley's one of those point guards in the NBA. I think he's been underrated, and he could definitely now at 31 and going on provide some insight to a player like Mitchell, especially hearing that how receptive Mitchell is. I want to go back into maybe a little bit more in depth into the trade in terms of the price that the Jazz paid and what they had to give up. Do you personally think it was a fair price in what they got for Conley?
It's funny how these things are bantered about, because here in town, obviously the thought is, boy, the Jazz got away with robbery here. They had to give up 3 players for 1, 2 first-round picks, and a lot of people, if they just heard that price tag, would go, my goodness, do the Jazz know that Conley's over 30? Do they know that he's had these injuries? Do they know, so on and so forth? And they would automatically think that the Memphis Grizzlies got away with something here. The truth is probably that both teams are really pleased with what they paid for what they're getting in return. But if we take a look at what the Jazz did give up, Jae Crowder probably hurt the fan base the most to see him go in this trade. Most of the feedback I've gotten from our listeners here on the Jazz radio station and on Twitter, of course, is that Jae Crowder is the one that hurts them the most, because he's a fan favorite. everywhere he's been. He's a hustle guy. He's a rebound guy. He can play defense. He's a tough guy. He's a leader. At times he can strike gold and shoot the ball well. But more often than not, as we saw especially in the playoffs against the Houston Rockets, he was left completely wide open because they decided to gamble on Jae Crowder not having a streaky night or having a streaky shooting career, that he was probably going to miss those shots. So Jae Crowder, yeah, you lose a locker room glue guy who's tough, who can give you 3 and D, and he's a very versatile player. But he does have his shortcomings on the offensive side of the floor. Kyle Korver, another fan favorite, honestly, everywhere he's been, said locker room exit interviews he was considering retirement, and he is 37, going on 38, I want to say. He missed a lot of the end of the season and postseason with a knee problem, and the Jazz, I don't think, thought if he were to come back, he'd be, I think, at $3.5 million would be his guarantee. I didn't think they thought he'd be able to hold out a whole 82-game season, being a regular night in and night out, count on him contributor. And then Grayson Allen, the young piece. The Jazz and a lot of people out here really feel that he showed some promise, some flash, some potential. He really turned himself into a NBA professional, I think, from the first day as an NBA rookie to the end of the season. He dealt with injury. He dealt with demotion, all with grace, all with professionalism. And I know that the Jazz were really excited on his high end. But what they get in return for Jae Crowder, Kyle Korver, and promise in Grayson Allen is a guy who can help them win now. And then similarly with the draft picks, these picks are couched or hedged in a protective manner. Of course, the 23rd overall pick, we'll see what that turns into in the draft here. And then the future pick, it's not lottery. If it is, it's late lottery. And if the team that gets that pick, if the Grizzlies hold on to it or if they trade it away, if someone strikes gold with that, I think the Jazz just kind of have to tip their cap and go, yep, we gambled on that, and that didn't work out in our favor, if Conley didn't work out. But the thing with draft picks, and draft picks are different for a team like, say, the Sixers or the Lakers or the Celtics than they are for a team like the Jazz or the Blazers or even the Spurs before they became big time. Draft picks are more valuable to small market teams. But draft picks are a years-long project of development and hope, whereas Mike Conley is ready to go today. So while it was a hefty price tag, I think the Jazz were willing to pay that because of what they're getting in return matches that value in their opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that, and I can see, I definitely see where you're coming from with that, and it just seems like a trade for the Jazz where they went out and they got the player that they think is that missing piece on their team. And I now want to transition and ask you, with Conley on this roster, and we've seen between the Warriors' injuries and not knowing what's going to happen in terms of free agency, we're seeing these storylines with the Rockets and the infighting that Paul could possibly be on the move. Where do you think this places the Jazz in terms of contenders in the Western Conference?
So it's interesting because of everything you just mentioned, all the moving pieces. Of course, Los Angeles Lakers continue to be a question mark even still, with Anthony Davis headed that way. Are they able to finagle their money and find another max player to go with he and LeBron, and suddenly they become, I think, a no-brainer favorite to win the Western Conference? Chris Paul, where does he land if it's not in Houston? Is there another super team that gets made between now and the beginning of the season in October in the Western Conference? If we just take it at face value as it is today, with the Warriors being without Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant, regardless of where they sign their contracts, with the Rockets in flux, with the Los Angeles Lakers now bringing in Anthony Davis, the Utah Jazz, I think, would have gone from the fifth team in the West to fighting for a playoff spot, honestly. I think that would have been their fate next season, because when you look at a team like Dallas on the rise, a team like Sacramento, who I don't think is quite there to be in this conversation, but they're on the precipice, and then, of course, what Denver and Portland can do, and we haven't even mentioned the Thunder. The Jazz, I think, were going to be fighting for their playoff lives if they ran this same team back again. Now with Mike Conley, they at least have an opportunity to I think they will. They've secured a spot in the top four in the West. Now it's a matter of, do the other pieces fall in their favor? Does another team have health issues? Do they make a trade at the deadline that adds that another piece? And honestly, we haven't even talked about Mike Conley is a piece that was missing from the Jazz. I don't think we can say that he is the piece because the Jazz still have need for help on the bench. They had to trade away really 3 bench guys to get Mike Conley into town. And so they've got to find money to fill that roster out. Now, Derek Favors, who is a franchise favorite, and he has won them playoff games and regular season games time and again that they would not have won had he not played. In fact, I would contend if he plays in Game 5 in Houston this year, down the stretch, he matched up better with Houston in that game than Rudy Gobert did, and I would contend there would have been a 6th game back in Utah. But that's for another time and another day to discuss. He has a team option of nearly $17 million. If the Jazz hold on to Derek Favors, which right now the reports in the media, at least out here, appear that the Jazz want to do that, that only leaves them the mid-room level exception. I think it's around $4.5 million, something like that, to go out there and find another guy, a 3-and-D vet, who can help you off the bench. If they were to renounce Favors' rights, then they suddenly have around $20 million to play with. And again, they got to fill out that 13-man roster, 12 and 1 inactive. They'll do so with some of their Salt Lake City Stars developmental league players. But if they really want to be a contender in the Western Conference, they're going to need to either get a really, really good season from Derek Favors where he suddenly finds a way to stretch the floor, or in my opinion, they'll have to, sadly, because he is one of my favorites, renounce his rights and use that money to improve elsewhere. So as far as them being a contender in the Western Conference, I think they actually have an opportunity to be in that conversation now, and on Tuesday of this week, they were not in that conversation.
Yeah, I think that Mike Conley, you're so right. It catapults them into that next level of contention. My last question here is, we're talking about how much they can be a contender next year. I guess what is more the expectations, since you're out there, what is the expectations around the team and the fan base? What are they kind of expecting from this team heading into next season, even though the offseason's not even really started yet?
Well, I'll level with you. The expectations were not met this season because they ended the 2017-18 season on a 29-5 run, where Ricky Rubio had suddenly become a guy that needed to be guarded because he had found his shot. And so when they won that first-round series against the Thunder, then went and had some health issues with Rubio and Donovan Mitchell's feet against the Rockets and lost that thing in the second round, there was a lot of hope and a lot of promise coming into the 18-19 year for the Utah Jazz. And most people, I think even nationally, were talking about them among the elite in the Western Conference. That did not turn out to be the case. Ricky Rubio, his averages turned out to be the real story. Same with a guy like Jae Crowder. And the Jazz caught a little bit of lightning in a bottle on that 29-5 into the previous season. And so even with a 50-win season under their belts, I don't think the Jazz met the high expectations that everyone in Utah or even maybe nationally had for them this last season. So going into 2019-20, now with Mike Conley here, 50 wins has got to be the absolute basement. And I'm talking the Jazz fans are at a fever pitch ready for this thing to get the Jazz in with their defense and now their improved offense. I think the expectation is to challenge for a Western Conference Finals appearance, and that would be the expectation, to have a shot to go to the finals, at least playing the other best team in the Western Conference in the Western Conference Finals. So to make it simple, the expectation, I think, of the fan base is to now not only take that next step into another round of the playoffs, but to get to the Western Conference Finals. If they don't make it, it can still be a very successful, wonderful season. Donovan Mitchell's 22. He'll then be 23. Lots of years ahead of him. Rudy Gobert still in his mid-20s. Lots of time ahead for the Utah Jazz. But the expectation certainly is as high as it has been since the Jazz had Carlos Boozer and Darren Williams in the Western Conference Finals themselves.
Well, they certainly got the player and the team, it looks like, to try to compete in a year where I think the window is wide open for a championship. Austin, thank you so much for doing this. Where can people check your stuff out at?
Jackson, thanks for the time. Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Austin Horton, Horton, Horton like the elephant, or especially visit 1280thezone.com. That's our website, or download the Zone Sports Network app. And check me out with my co-host Tony every day from 10 to 12 Mountain Time, so that's 12 to 2 Eastern in the afternoon. Or I also produce every afternoon from 5 to 9 Eastern on The Big Show. So check us out, 1280thezone.com.
Again, a big thank you to Austin for coming onto the podcast. Remember, go down into the show notes. There I have links to his Twitter and also where you can check him out at 1280thezone.com. Definitely recommend checking him out for all things, Utah sports, especially the Utah Jazz, because as you can see, they can be a legit contender next season. And that will wrap it up for this episode of the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to subscribe and rate this podcast on your favorite platforms, as that does a lot to help grow the show. Remember, new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. For more episodes, go down into the show notes and visit the link to JacksonNeillPodcast.com. There you'll find all of the episodes to this sports podcast, as well as the Jackson Neill Music Podcast and my interview series, Anything Goes with Jackson Neill. New episodes of the music podcast on Sundays, with Anything Goes coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you're a big fan of the show, maybe consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. For just a couple dollars a month, you can get access to bonus segments from both my sports and music podcasts, as well as bonus content from my interviews on Anything Goes. I write, record, and produce these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so any little bit of support really does go a long way. Link to Patreon down in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date on everything I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at JacksonNeil20. Today's music is by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next time.